Today, I'm having a Donald Duck moment. Or is it a Donald Trump moment? Lately, I and the rest of the world am not so sure. At any rate, today we have a cornucopia. Cornucopia. Look it up online. Many interesting and fascinating things from all corners of cyberspace, plus a central theme, a central topic. And then this will be followed by quotes from books, as had become a tradition. My new Instagram channel is called Narcissism with Vacnin. One word, Narcissism with Vacnin. That's my new channel because my old channel has been blocked by Facebook. And I've been asked on this channel, I've been asked by one of my followers, why did you delete your Jerry Springer video? I thought it was honest and ballsy. Well, first of all, I did not delete it. I had moved it to the playlist section. All the videos you think, well, most of the videos you think had disappeared because YouTube had deleted a few of my videos. Haters complained about hate speech and other things, and YouTube had deleted a few of my videos. But all those who survived, and you can't find them on the main screen, they are in the playlists. There are 7 or 8, I don't remember, or 9 playlists on my YouTube channel. Just go there and you will find the missing videos. Okay? Scan the page, you will find it. Playlists are mentioned in a variety of places. Okay, but what struck my interest in her comment was the use of the word ballsy. She connected honesty with courage. And I wrote back to her, ballsy is a peculiar choice of words to describe an infantile non-man. And she responded, well, it takes courage to be that honest with strangers and with yourself, also known as ballsy. And my response was, you're confusing courage with impulsive recklessness. An infantile narcissist is never courageous. He's just oblivious. He's indifferent to the consequences of his actions. Sometimes, if he's antisocial, he's defiant. Also, if you hold people in contempt, if you don't care what they think about you, it takes no courage to be honest and open. The potential consequences, the court of public opinion, don't matter. Finally, negative supply is preferable to no supply. The narcissist will go to any length and distance, even self-degradation, even self-humiliation, even self-destruction, self-shaming and self-trashing in public in order to secure supply. You can see this on the Jerry Springer show in dollops. The C word here is not courage, it's compulsion. The narcissist can't help it. Okay, today, later, the second half of the video, I'm going to read to you book excerpts from 3 books. One of the excerpts will provide a very unusual view of empathy. The second excerpt, that's Martin Luther King Jr. about love, what he had to say about love. And the third excerpt is about fear and how we had become a culture of fear, risk-averse, danger-averse, thrill-averse, novelty-averse. How we cocoon ourselves and how we socially distance long before the age of the pandemic. Fear had become the defining, motivating factor in our civilization. But before we go all there, I want to read to you a quote, a surprising quote. It's from a book called Cattle Kingdom. Cattle Kingdom, the hidden history of the cowboy West. It was written by Christopher Knowlton, and it was published in 2017. And there's a sentence there caught my eye. The longhorn bull was notoriously ornery, sullen, morose, solitary, and pugnacious. As one cattleman put it, the longer he lived, the meaner he became. I thought this applies to the longhorn bull, as well to one of our acquaintances, the narcissist. I've been asked, Aren't you ashamed to not be a man? Aren't you ashamed to admit in public that you're not a man? And to this I responded, aren't you ashamed to not be an astrophysicist? Aren't you devastated by the fact that you're not a psychologist? I am both. I learned to be both. I acquired the skill set of an astrophysicist and the skill set of a psychologist. You didn't. Aren't you ashamed of it? I didn't learn to be a man. You did. Should I be ashamed of it? To be a man is to play a role known as gender role. It's to act in a highly specific manner according to a script provided by society and the culture we're embedded in. So they teach you in college or university to be a physicist, to be a medical doctor, to be a psychologist, and at home, much earlier, they teach you to be a man, if you're lucky, or unlucky, I'm not sure anymore. I had been taught from age 4 to read, to write. I finished devouring my first encyclopedia at age 7, 30 volumes almost. So I didn't have time to learn how to be a man. And I don't play this role well. I have another shameful, disgraceful disclosure. I don't play football. I don't play baseball. And you know why? Because no one taught me how. I don't drive. I don't do many things. I'm not a father. I don't have children. Why should I be ashamed of any of this? On the other hand, you can only dream of to do what I'm doing. I have so many skills that you can only dream to possess. And yet I don't shame you for not being a physicist, or not being a psychologist, or not being a medical doctor. Why are you shaming me, trying to shame me, for not being a man? Response to another missive. I want to explain to that eternal professional victim, because she was very proud of the fact that she's a victim, that she'd been purely victimized, that she can't find any fault in herself, any fault in her behavior. She is the utter, perfect, unadulterated victim. So I want to tell you something. To refuse to victimize is also to victimize. Some victims are so invested in their victimhood, it had become a determinant of their identity. And if you refuse to victimize them, they resent it. They consider it abusive. To refuse to victimize them is to victimize them. So they sublimate it, they convert it somehow. They tell you, you don't pay me any attention. Some victims consider even negative attention, like physical abuse, verbal abuse, as a form of caring, as a form of sharing, as a tenuous connection. And when it's absent, they regard themselves as having been rejected, having been abandoned. Abuse is what assures them and reassures them that they have a place in their intimate partner's lives. They complain that the partner doesn't read, she complains that the partner didn't read her mind, didn't foresee her needs, was not sensitive enough. She complains that he didn't pay her any attention, and when you go through the letter, the email, you realize she's talking about negative attention. She complains of gaslighting because he refused to accept her version of reality. Projective identification and introjective identification are techniques used by perpetual, professional, proud victims to force other people to abuse and victimize them. Why? Because they love to be victimized. They feel good only when they feel bad. Victimhood, abuse, is their comfort zone. They had been conditioned from early childhood to identify abuse with love, to identify victimhood with care, to identify battering with attention. So pay attention. Search your souls. Are you this type of victim? Okay. Lydia Rangelovska, in one of our endless exchanges, suggested a new concept, which I found very, very fascinating. She said, the same way a narcissist collapses, and the same way a histrionic collapses, the same way perhaps a borderline collapses, sources of narcissistic supply can also collapse. Sources of narcissistic supply can suddenly stop providing narcissistic supply. They can turn off the faucet. They can go away. They can break up. They can absent themselves emotionally or physically or both. And at that moment, they stop providing the narcissist with what he needs most, secondary supply. We'll talk about it in a minute. And they become collapsed sources of narcissistic supply. And it occurred to me that Rangelovska's innovation, because it's a totally new concept to the best of my ability, Rangelovska's innovation fits well with the collapse of other elements in the narcissist's eternal quest for the holy grail of narcissistic supply. The source of supply can collapse, as Rangelovska had suggested, but also the pathological narcissistic space can collapse. Sources of primary supply can collapse. Intimate partners are sources of secondary supply, never primary supply. So sources of primary supply can collapse. And how does the narcissist cope with this? He copes with this via something called auto-supply or self-supply. He uses auto-supply or self-supply to create an equilibrium. Let me give you a simile, or in some ways a metaphor. Those of you who remember your school days, if you had studied physics, I don't know, in Europe, physics is mandatory. I don't know in the United States, with what's left of the education system, if physics is mandatory. But we were taught about communicating vessels. Communicating vessels are containers which are interconnected with pipes. And when you fill one of them with fluid, the fluid goes through the pipes to the other containers. And the level of the fluid in all the containers is the same. This is known as Stevin's law of communicating vessels. Stevin was a fascinating character, Simon Stevin. He was Dutch, which already makes him interesting. In Latin, his name was Stevinus. He was actually Flemish, to be more precise. He was mathematician, physicist, military engineer. He did amazing things. For example, he created a yacht, a land yacht, kind of a yacht with sails, but on land. He was a bizarre character. He translated many texts and so on. He said, his famous quote is, "A man in anger is no clever dissembler." So, Stevinus was the guy who came up with the idea of the communicating vessels. And it's a perfect simile to narcissistic supply. Because you pour narcissistic supply into the first container, into the first vessel, jar, jug, glass, doesn't matter. You pour narcissistic supply and it spreads equally across the various emotional and psychological needs of the narcissist. If you pour an insufficient amount of supply, the level will be very low in all these areas of psychodynamic functioning. The narcissist needs a constant infusion of supply to maintain the level across all communicating vessels high and the same. When there's not enough supply, when the supply is missing, the narcissist administers supply to himself or asks his intimate partner to administer supply to him. When the intimate partner administers supply to the narcissist, that's secondary narcissistic supply. And when the narcissist does it to himself, when he fulfills these vessels with narcissistic supply by himself, it's called auto-supply or self-supply. To refresh your memory, there are two categories of narcissistic supply and, consequently, two categories of narcissistic supply sources. Primary narcissistic supply is attention, both in public forms like fame, notoriety, infamy, celebrity, and in a private, interpersonal form, adoration, adulation, applause, fear, repulsion. It is important to understand that attention of any kind, positive or negative, constitutes primary narcissistic supply. Infamy is as sought after as fame. Being notorious is as good as being renowned. To the narcissist, his accomplishments can be imaginary, can be fictitious, or only apparent, as long as others believe that he is an achiever. Appearances count more, as far as a narcissist is concerned, count more than substance. What matters is not the truth, but the perception of the truth. It is impression management on steroids. Narcissistic supply comes in two forms: animate, direct, and inanimate, indirect. Inanimate supply is composed and comprised of all expressions of attention which are communicated impersonally, not personally. For example, in written form, via third parties, or as views on a YouTube video. Inanimate supply also includes aggregate measures of popularity and fame, number of friends and likes on Facebook, as I said, number of comments on YouTube, numbers of readers in a blog, statistics. That's inanimate supply. It has no face. It's faceless. Animate supply requires an interpersonal interaction with the source of the narcissistic supply, usually in the flesh. To sustain his sense of self-worth, the narcissist requires both types of supply, inanimate and animate, but especially the animate variety. He needs to witness firsthand the impact his false self has had on living, breathing, flesh and blood human sources and on his immediate environment. That's why isolation, quarantine, and social distancing are very, very difficult on narcissists. Now, triggers of primary narcissistic supply include being famous, being a celebrity, having notoriety, fame, infamy, I mentioned that, or having an air of mystique when the narcissist is considered to be mysterious, inaccessible, or having sex and deriving from it a sense of masculinity, virility, or femininity, or being close or connected to political, financial, military, spiritual movers and shakers, power, authority, or yielding and wielding this power. All these are triggers of primary supply. But who provides the supply? Sources of primary narcissistic supply are all those who provide the narcissist with narcissistic supply on a casual, random basis. Not so secondary narcissistic supply sources. Secondary narcissistic supply includes leading a normal life, normalcy. Just being able to present yourself, to appear to be normal, is a source of great pride for the narcissist. Having a secure existence, economic safety, social acceptability, upward mobility, and obtaining companionship. And so having a mate, having an intimate partner, possessing conspicuous wealth, being creative, running a business, and of course, the business is transformed into a pathological narcissistic space, possessing a sense of anarchic freedom, being a member of a group or a collective, having a professional or other reputation, being successful, owning property, flaunting one's status symbols, they are all secondary narcissistic supply. But the source of secondary narcissistic supply is the narcissist's intimate partner. She has a very important function. She records his moments of glory. And when he's down, when he cannot obtain supply, when his supply is deficient, she reminds him of these moments of glory. She's like an external hard disk, external memory. And she stores supply. She witnesses the supply and she stores it. And then when the narcissist needs it, she releases. It's like a slow release pill. She releases the supply. This way, she regulates the supply. That's her main function. The main function of the narcissist's intimate partner is regulatory, to regulate the flow of supply. When there is a collapsed source of narcissistic supply, again suggested originally by Lydia Rangeroska, when there's a collapsed source of narcissistic supply, the narcissist will try to compensate for this. So when the source of secondary supply had collapsed, the narcissist will try to obtain more additional primary supply. The narcissist will also try to provide himself with supply, auto-supply, self-supply, which we're going to discuss in a minute. When there is a collapsed source of primary supply, primary narcissistic supply, when when sources of primary supply vanish, disappear, mock the narcissist, when they create external notification and so on, when the narcissist remains bereft of all sources of primary supply, he's going to put the onus and the pressure on the source of secondary supply to regulate the deficiency, to cover up for the deficiency, to release memories of past moments of glory, past moments, past accomplishments, so as to compensate for the deficiency. And again, he's going to use auto-supply, self-supply as a regulatory tool. And finally, when the entire pathological narcissistic space collapses, to remind you, pathological narcissistic space is the physical places narcissists go to in order to obtain supply. The local pub, the library, the church. The narcissist family is a pathological narcissistic space usually. So when the pathological narcissistic space collapses, the narcissist tries to compensate by obtaining more primary supply. What's the role of auto-supply or self-supply in all this? Again, it has a regulatory role, and in this sense, it's the exact equivalent of an intimate partner. Again, we see autoeroticism, libidinal investment in the self. Auto-supply, self-supply are as good as having an intimate partner. They're interchangeable. Don't have an intimate partner, supply yourself as a narcissist. You can't supply yourself as a narcissist. You look for an intimate partner. It's all investment in the self. You can supply yourself in really dire straits when as a last resort. So it's a regulatory mechanism. It is tied to schizoid states where the narcissist is isolated, withdrawn. I refer you to the previous video that I made. And so he has no access to people. He has no access even to an intimate partner. He may have divorced. She may have abandoned him, cheated on him, betrayed him, or whatever. So he's in a schizoid state, isolated, withdrawn, recluse, lone wolf. And so at that moment, he will try to compensate via self-supply or auto-supply. Now, what is self-supply? What is auto-supply? It's anything that grants the narcissist narcissistic supply, but is not dependent on any input or feedback from other people. In other words, you remember that in narcissism, there is a god-awful confusion between internal objects and external objects. The narcissist misconstrues and considers external objects as totally internal. So worse comes to worse, rock bottom, what the narcissist does, he begins to relate to some of his internal objects as actually external. And he derives from these internal objects narcissistic supply as though and as if they were external. He may uplift himself with positive automatic thoughts. He may tell himself that he's great, that he's a genius, misunderstood, but still a genius. So he will give himself pep talks and so on. Not in a healthy way. Most of us, almost everyone does that from time to time, but in a sick, compulsive way, repetitive, and something that occupies the bulk of his time. So he's going to have a dialogue, he's going to establish a dialogue with his internal objects, thereby estranging himself from his internal objects to the point of psychosis almost to the point that he mistakes his internal objects as external objects. He still maintains a modicum, a measure of reality testing, and he knows that he's talking to himself. He knows that these objects don't exist out there. But he tends to identify them with external objects that had existed in his life from his past. And he tends to kind of in a process that I call twinning. He tends to twin a current, contemporary internal objects with the past external objects. So he would identify, for example, an internal object with his ex, with his ex-wife. He would identify an internal object with his teacher who had married him. He would, etc. So he would kind of twin the past with the future, with the present. And so this leads to several types of auto-supply. The most prominent by far is paranoid or persecutory ideation. Think about it. Paranoid ideation, the belief that you are at the center of some kind of collusion or conspiracy theory, aggrandizes you, makes you appear important, at least to yourself. If you believe yourself to be at the core or at the crux or to be the pivot and the axis of processes around you, that is the kind of magical thinking that elevates you, that renders you the center and the focus of attention. So paranoid and persecutory ideation are highly narcissistic, and they are a form of auto-supply, self-supply, because you don't need anything and anyone to buttress, prove, substantiate your paranoid and persecutory ideation. On the very contrary. Paranoia is a very solitary kind of state of mind. The second type of auto-supply or self-supply is delusionality. You can simply develop a delusion or a series of delusions. Some people develop a delusion that God himself is interested in their lives to the minutest details. He micromanages their lives. Others develop a delusion that, yeah, my wife had left me 46 years ago, but she will be back one day. I mean, there's no end. There's no way to specify all possible content of delusionality. But delusions are a very crucial, important mechanism for self-supply and auto-supply. Actually, there is even a therapeutic technique. It's called anchoring, like anchor of a ship. And it is when we reorient the narcissist towards self-supply. We push the narcissist to sort of wean himself off narcissistic supply and to substitute for it, to replace it with self-supply. Rather than resort to fickle and ephemeral external sources of narcissistic supply, the narcissist is taught in the anchoring technique, is encouraged to resort to himself for supply, to look forward with excited anticipation to the structured pursuit of, let's say, hobbies, vocations, to develop certain traits and skills and reward eliciting behaviors. And this self-mastery is a major source of supply. And this approach leverages the narcissist's grandiose solipsism and his fantasy defense mechanism, especially fantasies of omnipotence, and it renders the narcissist emotionally self-sufficient and proud of healthy progress. So here's an example of a therapeutic technique that uses knowingly, consciously, mechanisms of self-supply and auto-supply. But let's elaborate a bit on delusions, because delusions, that's the family of coping strategies that the narcissist is most acquainted with. When the narcissist is a child subjected to trauma and abuse, nowhere to hide, nowhere to escape, is being instrumentalized, parentified, objectified, beaten, sexually molested, is what to do? Well, the narcissist as a child escapes to delusionality. He develops a delusion, which is essentially the false self, a godlike entity, totally delusional, an imaginary friend, a comfort object that is delusional. So the narcissist's default, when there isn't enough supply, the narcissist's default is delusion. Unable to completely ignore contrarian opinion and data from reality, he transmutes them. Unable to face the dismal failure that he is, the narcissist partially withdraws from reality altogether. He loses reality testing. To soothe and to salve the pain of disillusionment, the narcissist administers to himself a mixture of lies, confabulations, distortions, half-truths, and outlandish interpretations of events around him. And these solutions, these delusional solutions, we can classify them into groups. Let's start with the delusional narrative solution. The narcissist constructs a narrative in which he figures as a hero. He's brilliant, he's perfect, he's irresistibly handsome, destined for great things, entitled, kind-hearted, wealthy, the center of attention, etc., etc., etc. He is the protagonist of his own novel of fiction. The bigger the strain on this delusional charade, the greater the gap between fantasy and reality, the more the delusion coalesces and solidifies. That's the irony. Delusion is a defense against reality. The more reality challenges the narcissist, the more delusional he becomes. That's why it's very wrong in therapy to challenge the narcissist's delusions, to introduce him, to force him to accept reality. Because when you do this, it entrenches him. He becomes even more truculent, obstinate, resistant to treatment. And finally, if it is sufficiently protracted, this delusion replaces reality altogether, and the narcissist's reality testing deteriorates. He withdraws, he draws his drawbridges, and may become schizotypal, catatonic, or schizoid. Again, I refer you to the previous video I made. Then there is the antisocial solution. The narcissist, all these solutions, to remind you, are in case the narcissist is unable to obtain supply. So here's a second family of solutions, the antisocial solution. The narcissist renounces reality. To his mind, those who pusillanimously fail to recognize his unbound talents, his innate superiority, his overarching brilliance, his perfection, his benevolent nature, his entitlement, his cosmically important mission, these people do not deserve consideration. They are, you know what? They are Untermenschen. They are not human. They are subhuman. Anyone who can gaze at the face of the narcissist, he's the sun. Yeah, you can't look at his face because he is glowing. There's an aura. He's saintly and godlike. And he's an amazing genius, and he's unprecedented in the annals of humanity. If you can't grasp this, if you disagree with this, if you're stupid enough to not realize it instantly, then something's wrong with you. What's wrong with you? You're not fully human. You're indistinguishable from monkeys and apes. So you don't deserve, you have no rights. You don't deserve any consideration. And the narcissist has no obligation towards you. The narcissist's natural affinity with the criminal, his lack of empathy, lack of compassion, deficient social skills, his disregard for social laws, social mores and morals. Now this affinity with the criminal erupts. It blossoms. It flourishes. The narcissist becomes a full-fledged antisocial psychopath. He ignores the wishes and needs of others. He breaks the law. He violates all rights, natural and legal. He holds people in contempt and disdain. He derides and decries society and its codes. He punishes the ignorant ingrates. He becomes contumacious. And that is because these people, to his mind, drove him to this state of deficient supply. They acted criminal. They are the criminals. They had acted criminally, and so he's just reciprocating. He's jeopardizing their safety, their lives, their property, their happiness, their mental health, because they've done it to him first. Defiance, tit for tat, quid pro quo. That's the second family. Now the third family is, I mentioned before, the paranoid schizoid solution. When narcissism fails as a defense mechanism, the narcissist develops paranoid narratives, self-directed confabulations, which place him at the center of others' allegedly malign attention. The narcissist intention and attention. The narcissist becomes his own audience, self-sufficient as his own, sometimes exclusive, source of narcissistic supply. The narcissist develops persecutory delusions. He perceives slights and insults where none were intended. This is known as hypervigilance. He becomes subject to ideas of reference, referential ideation. He believes that people are gossiping about him, mocking him behind his back, prying into his affairs, cracking his email. And that reminds me of Donald Trump so much that I'm going to take another sip from the Donald Duck mug. The narcissist is convinced that he is the center of malign and malintentioned attention. People are conspiring to humiliate him, to punish him, to restrict him, to abscond with his property, to prevent him from realizing his potential and self-actualizing, to delude him, to impoverish him, to confine him physically, to dwarf him intellectually, to censor him, to impose on his time, to force him to action, to force him to inaction, to frighten him, to coerce him, to surround him, to besiege him, to change his mind, to part with his values, to victimize, to murder him, and so on. No limit. Escalation to the end. And all this, the narcissist is the center of this universe of collusion, conspiracism, and inanity. Some narcissists withdraw completely from a world, from a universe populated with such minacious and ominous objects. But these objects are really projections of internal objects and processes, as you realize. And these narcissists avoid all social contact, except the most necessary. They refrain from meeting people, falling in love, having sex, talking to others, or even corresponding with others. In short, these narcissists become schizoid, not out of social shyness, but out of what they feel to be their choice. The schizoid doesn't have a choice, the real schizoid. Schizoid simply dislikes people, doesn't need sex, and is utterly asocial, not antisocial, asocial. Here the narcissist makes choices to let go, to give up certain proclivities and predilections that he has, certain tendencies and inclinations. He gives them up knowingly. But he gives them up in his view, in his distorted mind, in self-defense. The evil, hopeless world does not deserve me, they say to themselves. I shall waste none of my time and resources on it. Grandiose exit left. Now the next family is the paranoid aggressive explosive solution. The previous family was the paranoid schizoid solution. There's another variant, the paranoid explosive solution. Other narcissists who develop persecutory delusions resort to an aggressive stance, a more violent resolution of their internal conflict. They become verbally, psychologically, situationally, and very rarely physically abusive. They insult, castigate, humiliate, chastise, berate, demean, and deride their nearest and dearest, often their well-wishers and loved ones. They explode in unprovoked displays of rage, indignation, righteousness, condemnation, and blame. Theirs is an exegetic bedlam. They interpret everything, even the most innocuous, inadvertent, and innocent comment, as designed to provoke and humiliate. They sow fear, revulsion, hatred, and malignant envy. They flail against the windmills of reality, a pathetic, forlorn sight. But often they cause real and lasting damage. Fortunately, mainly to themselves. And there's a middle ground version between the paranoid schizoid and the paranoid aggressive, and that's the paranoid passive aggressive. I refer you to videos on this channel which deal with passive aggression or negativistic personality disorder. Another family is the masochistic, actually. Masochistic, self-harming, avoidant solution. Some narcissists, when they cannot secure a supply, they are angered by the lack of narcissistic supply. Such a narcissist directs some of this fury inwards, punishing himself for his failure to secure supply. And this is masochistic behavior, and it has the added benefit of forcing the narcissist closest and nearest and dearest to assume the roles of dismayed spectators or of persecutors. And so either way, to pay him the attention that he craves. It's like he's shouting from the rooftops, I'm about to commit suicide. I'm about to harm myself. I'm about to hurt myself. It's a cry not for help. It's a cry for attention. Self-administered punishment often manifests as self-handicapping masochism, a narcissistic cop-out. By undermining his work, his relationships, his efforts, the increasingly fragile and vulnerable narcissist avoids additional criticism and censure, avoids negative supply. Self-inflicted failure is the narcissist doing, and so proves that he is the master of his own fate. He is in control. This is a technique very often used by covert narcissists. Masochistic narcissists keep finding themselves in self-defeating, self-destructive circumstances, which render success impossible. Millen wrote in 2000 that masochist narcissists do this, they sabotage everything, they undermine everything. They do this to prevent an objective assessment of their performance, to render it improbable. They act carelessly. They withdraw in mid-effort. They are constantly fatigued, bored, sick, disaffected. And so passive-aggressively they sabotage their own lives. Their suffering is defiant, in-your-face suffering, conspicuous victimhood, ostentatious self-ruination. They get drunk, they do drugs, they overspend, they overeat. And so by deciding to abort their lives, to reject their lives, as Cleckley put it, they reassert actually their omnipotence. Not only am I in control of myself, I'm in control of your emotions, because I make you sorry for me, I make you sad, I make you depressed. I'm going to induce a state of mind in you. I'm going to play with your emotions. I'm going to sacrifice myself to F up your mind. The narcissist pronounce in public misery and self-pity. They are compensatory. And again, as Milon said, they are intended to reinforce his self-esteem against overwhelming convictions of worthlessness. The narcissist's tribulations and anguish render him, in his eyes, unique. I am suffering, so I never heard of anyone that suffered like me. I mean, what he did to me, I think no one else had ever experienced this. It makes him saintly, this suffering. This victimhood is virtuous, it's righteous, it's resilient and significant. He becomes an empath, then he graduates, and he becomes a super empath. Then he graduates and he becomes a supernova empath. This empath label is grandiose. It's highly narcissistic. These are narcissists who had chosen the masochistic solution. These narcissists are, in other words, self-generating. What they do, they replace narcissistic supply from the outside, or they react to narcissistic injuries and mortifications by generating supply from the inside, self-generated narcissistic supply. And they generate this supply by playing the victim, by becoming the victim, by identifying with victimhood, not only as a state of mind, but as an identity. And so paradoxically, the worse is anguish, the more horrible is unhappiness, the more relieved and elated such a narcissist feels. He feels good. He feels really good when he feels really, really bad. So a narcissist reacts to a deficient narcissistic supply very much as a drug addict reacts to the absence of a particular drug. The dwindling or absence of supply is a trauma, and the narcissist experiences post-traumatic stress. The narcissist constantly consumes, preys upon, adoration, admiration, approval, applause, attention, other forms of narcissistic supply. When lacking, when they're deficient, a narcissistic deficiency dysphoria sets in. The narcissist then appears to be depressed. His movements slow down. His sleep patterns are disordered. He becomes insomniac or sleeps too much. His eating patterns change. He gorges on food or avoids it altogether. The narcissist is constantly dysphoric when he doesn't have supply. He is anhedonic, so he's sad and he finds no pleasure in anything, including his former pursuits, hobbies, professions, and interests. The narcissist is subjected to violent mood swings. He becomes mood labile. Mainly, he has rage attacks, and he has visible and painful kind of emotional dysregulation. So, in a way, deficient supply pushes the narcissist to become a borderline. The scholar Grotstein suggested that borderline personality disorder is failed narcissism. When the child fails to develop narcissistic personality disorder, the child ends up being in a midway house, and that is borderline personality disorder. It's a failed narcissist. So when the narcissist fails, when he collapses, he reverts to a borderline state. And you see these extremely anguishing efforts at self-control, and they fail. He compulsively and ritually resorts to some addiction, alcohol, drugs, reckless driving, shopaholism. He develops obsessive-compulsive rituals. This gradual disintegration is the narcissist's futile effort both to escape his predicament and to sublimate the aggressive urges that he has. He's frustrated. Dullard in 1939 suggested the frustration-aggression hypothesis. He said frustration becomes aggression. So the narcissist is frustrated. He cannot obtain supply. He becomes aggressive. His whole behavior seems constrained, artificial, and effortful. The narcissist gradually turns more and more mechanical, detached, and unreal. His thoughts constantly wander or become obsessive and repetitive. His speech may falter. He appears to be far away in a world of his narcissistic fantasies, where narcissistic supply is aplenty. So the narcissist withdraws from his painful existence, where others fail to appreciate his greatness, his special skills, his talents, his potential, his achievements. Narcissist ceases to bestow himself upon a cruel, indifferent universe. He is punishing humanity for its shortcoming, its inability to realize how unique he is and what a gift he is. When narcissism fails as a defense mechanism, the narcissist develops paranoid delusions, as we said, self-directed confabulations, which place him at the center of others' allegedly malicious intention. The narcissist becomes his own audience and self-sufficient as his own, sometimes exclusive source of supply. And again, to remind you, some narcissists go into a schizoid mode. I refer you to the previous video I made. Narcissistic or schizoid withdrawal. This kind of narcissist isolates himself, a hermit in the kingdom of his hurt. He minimizes his social interactions and uses messengers, flying monkeys, to communicate with the outside. Devoid of energy, the narcissist can no longer pretend to succumb to social conventions. His former compliance gives way to open withdrawal. It's a rebellion of sorts. Smiles are transformed to frowns. Courtesy becomes rudeness. Emphasized etiquette is used as a weapon, an outlet of aggression, an act of self-righteous, sanctimonious violence. The narcissist is blinded by his pain, seeks to restore his balance, to take another sip of the narcissistic nectar that is narcissistic supply. And in this compulsive quest, out of his control, the narcissist turns both to and upon those nearest to him. His real attitude emerges. For him, his nearest and dearest are nothing but tools, one-dimensional instruments of gratification, functions, sources of supply, extensions, pimps of supply, catering to his narcissistic lust. Having failed to procure for him his drug, narcissistic supply, the narcissist regards friends, colleagues, and even family members as dysfunctional, frustrating, potentially hostile objects, he develops what we call persecutory objects. In his wrath and fury and unmitigated rage, he tries to mend these people, to fix them, by forcing them to perform again, to function again. And he's very adamant about it, relentless, callous, reckless. And this is coupled with merciless self-flagellation, a deservedly self-inflicted punishment the narcissist feels. In extreme cases of deprivation, the narcissist entertains suicidal thoughts, suicidal ideation. This is how deeply he loathes his self and his dependence on others. Throughout this mess, the narcissist is beset by a pervading sense of malignant nostalgia, harking back to a past which never existed. Make America great again, except in the thwarted fantastic grandiosity of the narcissist. The longer the lack of supply, the longer supply is missing, the more the narcissist glorifies, rewrites, reframes, misses, and mourns a totally invented past. This nostalgia serves to enhance other negative feelings, amounting to clinical depression. The narcissist proceeds to develop paranoia. He concocts a persecuting world, and prosecuting world, incorporating in this world his life's events and his social milieu. He creates a giant Game of Thrones and gives everyone a role, every place, every person, every event, all his personal history. And this gives meaning. This online virtual game, this MMOG multiple player game, this gives meaning to what is erroneously perceived by the narcissist to be a sudden shift from oversupply to no supply. In this imaginary paranoid universe, there's a reason he's not getting supply. It's a conspiracy. It's a collusion. There's no other explanation. He's so self-evidently superior. He has so much to offer. He's such a gift. He's such an endowment. He's so perfect. He's so brilliant. He's so handsome. He is so smart. All narcissists have 190 IQ. Didn't you know? And yet, he's rejected. He's ignored. He's mocked. He's ridiculed. He's abandoned. He's disrespected. And it grates. And in extremes, it mortifies, creates mortification. And so he needs to concoct, to create external mortification. He builds a paranoid theory. A paranoid theory of the world. It's everyone against him. It's malicious, malevolent intent working behind the scenes to deprive him, to discriminate against him. It's injustice writ large. It's institutional, it's individual. It's individuals acting within institutions. Everyone, everywhere is against him. Otherwise, he would have received much more supply. Proof that this paranoid ideation is not a delusion is that he's not getting supply. Does it stand to reason? Of course he should have received supply. Plenty. These theories of conspiracy account for the decrease in narcissistic supply. The narcissist then, frightened, in pain, in despair, embarks upon an orgy of self-destruction intended to generate alternative supply sources, alternative attention, at any cost. The narcissist is poised to commit the ultimate narcissistic act, self-destruction, in the service of self-aggrandizement. When he is deprived of supply, both primary and secondary, that's important, the narcissist feels annulled, non-existent, hollowed out, mentally disemboweled. This is an overpowering sense of evaporation, disintegration into molecules of terrified anguish, dissolution, helpless and inexorable. Without narcissistic supply, the narcissist crumbles to dust, like the zombies or the vampires one sees in horror movies. And the only sustenance is not blood, it's supply. It is terrifying. The narcissist will do anything to avoid this fate. Think about the narcissist, consider him as a drug addict. his withdrawal symptoms, his cold turkey, are the same like a drug addict's, like a junkie's. Delusions, physiological effects, irritability, emotional lability. In the absence of regular supply, narcissists often experience brief decompensatory psychotic episodes. This also happens while in therapy or following a life crisis accompanied by major narcissistic injury. And these psychotic episodes may be closely allied to another feature of narcissism, magical thinking. Narcissists are like children in this sense. I keep saying it in all my videos. Many narcissists, for instance, fully believe in two things: that whatever happens, they will prevail, and that good things will always happen to them. It is more than mere belief. It's magical thinking that is experienced as reality. Narcissists just know it, the same way one knows about air or gravity, directly, immediately, assuredly, unthinkingly, automatically. The narcissist believes that no matter what he does, he will always be forgiven, always prevail in triumph, always come on top. I call it narcissistic immunity. The narcissist is therefore fearless in a manner perceived by others to be both admirable and insane. The narcissist attributes to himself divine and cosmic immunity. He cloaks himself in this immunity. It renders him invisible to his enemies and to the power of evil. The narcissist is a comic strip. It's a Marvel movie. Not marvelous? Marvel. It is a childish phantasmagoria. But to the narcissist, it's very real. The narcissist knows with religious certainty that good things will always happen to him. With equal certitude, the more self-aware narcissists, and there are quite a few of them, this kind of narcissist, self-aware, knows that he will squander this good fortune time and again. It's a painful experience best avoided. He knows that. So no matter what serendipity or fortuity, what lucky circumstance, what blessing the narcissist receives, he always strives with blind fury to deflect them, to deform them, and to ruin his chances. And this is his only success: self-destruction. Now, the next video, I'm going to read 3 excerpts from 3 books. A very surprising excerpt about empathy, Martin Luther King's words on love, which should resonate through the ages, and an excerpt about the culture of fear. Are we on? Oh my God. Wait a minute. I don't believe in God. Okay, let's get it straight. My name is Mini Vacnin, and I'm the author of Сэм Вакнин. I think I got that one wrong. Let's try again. My name is Сэм Вакнин, and I'm the author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism, Meaning Revisited, and a host of other books and ebooks about personality disorders and other topics. I'm also a professor of psychology, and you're lucky not to be my students. Trust you me. Today we are going to make some order, finally. In science, we have something called Occam's razor. It's also known as the law of parsimony. If there is a proliferation of theoretical entities, if there's a proliferation, too many, preponderance of symbols, hypotheses, assumptions, labels, diagnoses, and so on, something is wrong. Nature is simple. Nature is aesthetic. Nature works with a minimal number of variables to produce the maximum number of phenomena. So here we are with covert NPD, covert HPD, covert borderline, collapse narcissist, collapse borderline who wants to be a narcissist, collapse narcissist who wants to be antisocial, collapse antisocial who wants to be Jordan Peterson. Something is wrong. Something is wrong because there are too many entities and we need to reduce them to the minimal number. Actually, This is not my first attempt at doing this. I tried it 25 years ago for the first time. At that time, I suggested that all cluster B personality disorders are actually a single phenomenon, a single clinical entity. And then I expanded and I said that most mental health problems emanate from disturbances in narcissism and in the constellation and formation of the self. At that time, there wasn't much evidence to support this. And people were busy, scholars and psychologists were busy making lists. It was a primitive stage of diagnostic psychology, diagnostic clinical psychology. It was similar to the 18th century in botany, when someone like Carolus Linnaeus was walking the fields and cataloging plants. So psychologists were doing the same. They were making lists, and then they put all the lists together, and they called it the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which was nothing but a compilation of lists of criteria, each criterion corresponding to a symptom. But these were still lists. They were dead. They were inert. What was missing was the motion, the life, the dynamics. People are not dead. They're not inert. Even mentally ill people are not dead, vast majority of them. So there are things going on inside them. There are dynamics, there are processes. And these, of course, were not captured by the DSM's categorical lists. Another problem the DSM had, it was polythetic. In other words, two people with the same diagnosis could share very little in common. And so the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual Edition 5, published in 2013, tried to cope with this by becoming a bit more dimensional, a bit more descriptive, a bit more dynamic, and by introducing and proposing alternative models, diagnostic models for at least a few personality disorders, such as narcissistic and borderline. But it's a far cry from what I will be talking about today. Very far cry. What I want to propose is that all personality disorders, and actually the majority of mental health disorders, have to do with a confusion between external and internal objects. When people confuse internal objects with external objects, there's mental illness. Now, internal objects can be, for example, voices of your parents, or role models, or peers, or teachers, or caregivers, grandpa, grandma. These voices were internalized and became your voices. They talk to you from time to time. These are called introjects. Your conscience is an example of an amalgamation of these voices. Your superego, as Freud put it. Other constructs, they are internal. For example, we keep talking about the true self in narcissism. That's an internal construct. So within the apartment, within the house, that is your mind, that is your soul. I would have said soul had I believed in a soul, but your mind. Within this space, there are many pieces of furniture. Some of them are mobile and active and reactive. Some of them are just there, inert. They provide the background and the scenery. And these are internal objects. And then there's, of course, external objects. For example, I am an external object, believe it or not. I know most of you have internalized me already, and I appear in your nightmares, but I'm still an external object. And so when people confuse internal and external objects, there's mental illness. Let's take two examples, psychosis and narcissism. In psychosis, the psychotic, the person with psychotic disorder, considers his internal objects to be external. He hears voices. These voices are actually internal voices, but he perceives them as coming from the outside. He sees things. He's hallucinating. And these images, this external imagery, he perceives it as external, actually comes from the inside. These are figments of his own imagination and memories. So this is psychosis, when the internal becomes external. Narcissism is exactly the opposite. It's when the external becomes internal. The narcissist does not recognize the autonomous and independent existence of other people. He immediately takes a snapshot. He internalizes them as inner representations, he converts other people in his life, especially if they are significant, for example, sources of narcissistic supply, he converts them into internal objects that he can then manipulate and control safely without the risk of abandonment and pain, hurt. So these are two examples, diametrically opposed. The narcissist internalizes external objects. The psychotic externalizes internal objects. And so, if this is the case, we can easily show, if we use this as a unifying principle, we can easily show that all personality disorders and a majority of mental health disorders are actually a single clinical entity. Let's focus on cluster B, because that's my expertise and that's also the main topic of this channel. All cluster B disorders, the erratic or dramatic personality disorders, narcissistic, borderline, histrionic, and antisocial, all of them could be easily described as a single personality disorder, a single clinical entity with overlays. So you would have a single personality disorder with a narcissistic overlay, and then the same personality disorder, but this time with a borderline overlay, or antisocial overlay, or histrionic overlay. And even more, people would transition between these overlays. Today you could be narcissistic, but tomorrow you could definitely be borderline. And the next day, if you are provoked, if you are under big stress, if you anticipate abandonment, if you are anxious, you could become a psychopath. In other words, patients with this single personality disorder would display all the traits and all the behaviors of all the overlays, all of them. And they would switch, they would move between these overlays. Every narcissist is also to some extent antisocial. Ask any spouse of a narcissist. Every borderline is psychopathic. Every histrionic is psychopathic and narcissistic, of course. I mean, these distinctions are artificial. But that they're artificial doesn't bother me. What bothers me, they're wrong. And so every single overlay, so you remember there's an underlying personality disorder and it has overlays. And every single overlay in my theory has three states: overt or classic, collapsed, and covert. So every single one of these overlays, narcissistic, borderline, psychopathic, histrionic, would have an overt state, overt narcissist, a collapsed state, collapsed narcissist, and a covert state, covert narcissist, each and every one of them. And people would transition between these states. It's not a type. There's no type constancy. But every classic narcissist is sometimes covert and sometimes collapsed, of course. If he fails repeatedly to obtain supply, he becomes collapsed. So people transition between overt and collapse and covert and covert and overt and collapse and covert and overt and collapse and covert. Did I do it fast enough? I can do it even faster. I will show you in another video. And so this transition is the outcome of two external stressors. In other words, patients or people with personality disorder, this single personality disorder, would transition between overlays and between the states in each overlay because of two reasons. And these reasons are stressors. They create anxiety and stress. The first reason is what I call the gap. In narcissism, for example, it would be the grandiosity gap. It's when the reality intrudes, when reality challenges the narrative that underlies the overlay, when reality doesn't let you anymore use your defense mechanisms to fend it off, to reframe it, to rewrite it, to regard it differently, when it's too much, when it's too strong, when it overwhelms you. Reality could be external, but it could be internal. For example, in the case of the borderline, the reality would mostly be the borderline's emotions. Her emotions are dysregulated, so they would take over her. They would overwhelm her. She would drown in her emotions. So this is the gap. And the second reason for these frequent transitions between states and overlays is narcissistic mortification. Now, everyone has narcissistic defenses and traits. Everyone has healthy narcissism. Narcissism is a universal human phenomenon. It's only when it goes out of whack, when it's exaggerated and caricatured, when it's imbued with cognitive deficits such as grandiosity, only then do we talk about a disorder. But otherwise, everyone has narcissism. So narcissistic mortification can happen to anyone and everyone, even a healthy person. But if the person is not healthy, if the person has this underlying personality disorder, the mortification would deliver a blow, a blunt force blow, and would push him from one state to another, from, I don't know, collapse to covert, from overt to collapsed, and would also push him from one overlay to another. Mortification can cause the narcissist to become borderline, and the borderline to become psychopath, as we will discuss a bit later. So today's video, what I want to do is I want to provide you with a map. I want to provide you with checklists. Each and every overlay and state we will discuss today has separate videos on this channel. I dedicated separate videos to each and every one of these. So please go to the search box. It is signified by a magnifying glass. Go to the search box on my YouTube channel and type in. It's like when you use your finger to generate letters on the screen. It's called typing. It's an old art form, now long forgotten. Type in the keywords, and lo and behold, you will get an avalanche of relevant videos. Use this avalanche to your benefit. Click on the videos and watch them. Today is just a summary. So a few things about the covert state. Remember, there are three states: overt, classic, collapsed, and covert. Let's dedicate a few words to the covert state. The covert state, the covert aspires to be overt. The covert state is the state of aspiration, the wish to become classic or overt. The covert narcissist wants to become classic narcissist. The covert narcissist, when he grows up, he wants to emulate his role model, and his role model is Donald Trump, the grandiose, overt, classic, in your face, my way or the highway, take it or leave it, that's the way it is, baby, grandiose narcissist. So coverts aspire to be overts. Second point, coverts are not self-efficacious. They fail. They are the result of failure. Remember, overt, collapse, covert. Covert is the inevitable outcome of collapse, and collapse is a failure. If you're a narcissist, the failure is to obtain narcissistic supply. If you're a psychopath, the failure is to realize your goals. If you are histrionic, the failure is to sexually conquer someone or to tease someone. If you are a borderline, the failure is to ensure the continuous, unmitigated, uninterrupted presence of your intimate partner in a functioning relationship. These are all failures, and they create collapse. And then once the collapse is in, there's a transition to a covert state. So there are always transitions, always, because reality is merciless, absolutely merciless, and pushes you out of your comfort zone repeatedly. So there's always transition from overt to covert, back to overt, back to covert, back to overt. And these are always done via a stage of collapse, which follows a stage of gap and mortification. I hope you got the picture. Now let's zero in on some of the types. Covert narcissist. There are like 2 million videos on covert narcissists, and about half a video of these, half of one video is accurate. The rest you can safely hit the delete button. Covert narcissist has been first described by two scholars, the late Cooper, he died 3 weeks ago, and Akhtar in 1989. And here's what they had to say. And what they had to say about covert narcissists is the only thing you should listen to. The rest is rubbish, especially online. So they said the following. The self-concept of the covert narcissist, inferiority, morose self-doubts, marked propensity toward feeling ashamed, fragility, relentless search for glory and power, marked sensitivity to criticism and realistic setbacks. What about the covert's interpersonal relationships? Inability to genuinely depend on others and trust them, chronic envy of others' talents, possessions, and capacity for deep object relations, capacity to love, lack of regard for generational boundaries, disregard for other people's time, refusal to communicate, passive aggression. What about social adaptation? Nagging aimlessness, shallow vocational commitment, dilettante-like attitude, multiple but superficial interests, chronic boredom, aesthetic taste that is ill-informed and imitative. I don't like this list. The more I read it, the more I think it's me. I hope Minnie is not listening. Ethics, standards, and ideals. The covert narcissist. Readiness to shift values to gain favor. It's not like the borderline, by the way. The borderline shifts values, but she shifts values, she changes her values from day to day, literally, because she doesn't have an identity, a coherent, cohesive core identity. She has something called identity disturbance or identity diffusion. The covert narcissist shifts values because it's expedient. He wants to gain something. In this sense, he's psychopathic. Pathological lying, materialistic lifestyle, delinquent tendencies, inordinate moral relativism, irreverence towards authority, contumaciousness. What about love and sexuality? Perish the thought. Covert narcissist, inability to remain in love, impaired capacity for viewing the romantic partner as a separate individual with his or her own interests, rights, and values, inability to genuinely comprehend the incest taboo, occasional sexual perversions. Sounds delicious, I must say. Cognitive style. I'm off to find a covert narcissist after this video, of the right sex. Cognitive style. Knowledge often limited to trivia. It's called headline intelligence, by the way. Forgetful of details, especially names. Impaired in the capacity for learning new skills. Tendency to change meanings of reality when facing a threat to self-esteem. Language and speaking used for regulating self-esteem. That's it. That's the covert narcissist. That's the only clinical definition that we teach in universities. Ignore and forget the heap of trash that passes for knowledge online. What about the collapsed narcissist? I would like to talk a bit about the collapsed narcissist and in much more detail. That's a topic that is much neglected, even online. Let's start with the psychological development background in childhood. There was a famous psychoanalyst in the 40s and 50s. Her name was Karen Horney. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. By far my favorite psychologist of all time. I keep reading I keep making a point of reading all her books once a decade, and the time is coming now. Karen Horney is Horney. Karen Horney pointed out that the child is dehumanized and instrumentalized in abusive families. His parents love him not for what he really is, but for what they wish and imagine him to be, the fulfillment of their dreams and frustrated wishes. The child becomes the vessel of his parents' discontented lives, a tool, a magic brush with which they can transform their failures into successes, their humiliation into victory, their frustrations into happiness. The child is taught to ignore reality and to occupy the parental fantastic space. I mockingly, jokingly, I usually say that it's a family where the child is not put on a pedestal, but the pedestal is put on the child. Such an unfortunate child, I'm continuing, feels omnipotent and omniscient, perfect and brilliant, worthy of adoration and entitled to special treatment. The faculties that are honed by constantly brushing against bruising reality, faculties like empathy, compassion, realistic assessment of one's abilities and limitations, realistic expectations of oneself, of others, personal boundaries, teamwork, social skills, perseverance, goal orientation, not to mention the ability to postpone gratification, delay gratification, and to work hard to achieve things. All these are the outcomes of brushing against reality, of the friction of life. They're all lacking or missing in such a child. And this kind of child, Peter Pan, puer adolescent, when he turns adult, he sees no reason to grow up, no reason to invest in his skills and education. He's convinced that his inherent genius should suffice. He is a wunderkind. He feels entitled for merely being, rather than for actually doing. It reminds me of the nobility, in the previous centuries. They felt entitled not by virtue of any merit or accomplishment, but as the inevitable foreordained outcome of the fact that they were born, of their birthright. So it's like this kind of children, they belong to a new aristocracy, a new nobility, and we should all serve them in a kind of mental feudalism. In other words, the child is not meritocratic, but aristocratic. Why am I talking so much? This is the epitome and quintessence of narcissism. It's a narcissist. But such a mental structure is brittle, fragile, vulnerable, susceptible to criticism and disagreement, open to the incessant encounter with a harsh and intolerant world. Deep inside, narcissists of both kinds, narcissists that were fashioned by classic abuse and narcissists yielded by being idolized, both kinds of narcissists, they feel inadequate. They feel phony, the imposter syndrome. They feel fake, inferior, and deserving of punishment. And this is where I beg to differ with Millen. Millen makes a distinction between several types of narcissists, and he wrongly, in my view, assumes that the classic narcissist is the outcome of overvaluation, idolization, spoiling, and so is possessed of supreme, unchallenged self-confidence and is devoid of any self-doubt. According to Millen, it is the compensatory narcissist, another type, who falls prey to nagging self-doubts, feelings of inferiority, and a masochistic desire for self-punishment. But this distinction is unnecessary because it's wrong. There is only one type of narcissist. There are two developmental paths and two ways to express narcissism. Trump's way of expressing narcissism is not the way that, for example, someone who is more covert would do it. But all narcissists are besieged by deeply ingrained, though at times not conscious, I will grant Millen that, deeply ingrained feelings of inadequacy, fears of failure, masochistic desires to be caught and penalized, a fluctuating sense of self-worth regulated by narcissistic supply, and an overwhelming sensation of fakeness. That's why all narcissists, are hypervigilant. That's why they react to even the most innocuous comment as though it were an attack or a slight. They become very aggressive if they think they've been offended. The grandiosity gap between a fantastically grandiose and unlimited self-image and the actual limited accomplishments and achievements of the narcissist, this grandiosity gap is grating. Its recurrence, because it happens all the time, threatens the precariously balanced house of cards that is the narcissistic personality. The narcissist finds to his chagrin that people out there are much less admiring, much less accommodating, much less accepting than his adulating parents. As the narcissist grows old, he often becomes the target of constant derision and mockery. It's a sorry sight indeed. He's a buffoon, pompous, full of himself, full. The narcissist's claims of superiority appear less plausible and substantial the more and the longer he makes them or insists on them. Pathological narcissism, originally a defense mechanism intended to shield the narcissist from an injurious world, becomes the main source of hurt. It's the narcissism that generates the injuries. It's counterproductive, it's dangerous. Overwhelmed by negative or absent narcissistic supply, the narcissist is forced to let go of his narcissistic defenses, and that's when collapse happens. The narcissist then has to compensate for the collapse, and he does this by becoming covert. So, overt, challenges by reality, very painful, very mortifying. Narcissistic injuries are plenty. Narcissists cannot stand it anymore. He falls apart, he collapses, he's mortified, and he becomes covert. But the covert narcissistic phase is a delusional phase, and there are variants of covert narcissism. It's not a single thing. The narcissist resorts to self-delusion, unable to completely ignore contrarian opinion and data. The narcissist reframes them, he transmutes them. Unable to face the dismal failure that he is, the narcissist partially withdraws from reality. To soothe and to salve the pain of disillusionment, the narcissist administers to himself a mixture of lies, distortions, half-truths, and outlandish interpretations of events around him. And these are the covert states. Now, there are several types of covert narcissism depending on the delusional solution. Let's start one by one. First, there is the delusional narrative solution. It's a delusional covert narcissism. The narcissist constructs a narrative, a story, piece of fiction, a confabulation, in which he figures as a hero, a protagonist. In this newly invented piece of fiction or story, he's brilliant. He's again brilliant, perfect, irresistibly handsome, like me, for example, destined for great things, entitled, powerful, wealthy, center of attention, etc. The bigger the strain on this delusional charade, the greater the gap between his fantasies and reality, the more the delusion is entrenched, coalesces, and solidifies. Finally, if it is sufficiently protracted, the delusion replaces reality and the narcissist's reality testing deteriorates. He withdraws his bridges and may become schizotypal, catatonic, or schizoid. The second type of solution is the antisocial solution, and these are the antisocial covert narcissists. We all know them. They are covert, they have pseudo-humility, they have false modesty, but they are passive-aggressive and they're vicious, malevolent and malicious. The narcissist who adopts this solution to the grandiosity gap. You remember what these solutions are? They are attempts to reconcile painful reality with grandiose, fantastic self-image. There's a gap. Reality doesn't support the grandiose image. So these are the solutions. The solution is to become covert, but you can become delusionally covert or, as I'm about to explain, psychopathically covert. This kind of narcissist renounces reality. To his mind, those who pusillanimously fail to recognize his unbound talents, his innate superiority, his overarching brilliance, his benevolent nature, entitlement, his cosmically important mission, his perfection, the idiots, the morons who can't grasp his divinity, they don't deserve him. They don't deserve him. And they don't deserve consideration because they are less than human. Or as a German would say, Untermenschen. Oh, I love German. No such language to express unbridled psychopathic narcissism. Sometimes I suspect they invented the mental condition. Anyhow, the narcissist's natural affinity with the criminal, with the antisocial, his lack of empathy, lack of compassion, deficient social skills, disregard for social laws and mores and morals. Now, when the grandiosity gap is big, there's a lot of stress, and he chooses a covert solution. Now, his psychopathy erupts and blossoms. He becomes a full-fledged antisocial psychopath, or if you want to use media hype, sociopath. He ignores the wishes and needs of other people. He breaks the law. He violates everyone's rights, natural and legal. He holds people in contempt and disdain. He derides and decries society and its codes. He is vengeful. He punishes the ignorant ingrates that, to his mind, drove him to this state and he would do anything to demolish them. He acts criminally. He jeopardizes safety, lives, and property. In extreme cases, he might become a mass shooter or a serial killer. The third type of covert solution is the paranoid schizoid solution. When narcissism fails as a defense mechanism, The narcissist develops paranoid persecutory narratives, self-directed confabulations, which place the narcissist at the center of other people's allegedly malign intention. This is what most conspiracy theories do. They usually choose this solution. Majority of conspiracy theories are collapsed, covert narcissists who chose this solution. The narcissist becomes his own audience. He is self-sufficient in some way, has his own, sometimes exclusive source of narcissistic supply. This is called self-supply. The narcissist develops persecutory delusions. He perceives slights and insults where none were intended, hypervigilance. He becomes subject to referential ideation, ideas of reference. He thinks that people are gossiping about him, mocking him behind his back, prying into his affairs, cracking his email, I don't know, analyzing and dissecting everything he does or doesn't do. He's convinced that he is the center of malign and mal-intentioned attention. People are conspiring to humiliate him, punish him, abscond with his property, delude him, cheat with his wife, impoverish him, confine him physically or intellectually, censor him, impose on his time, force him to action, prevent him from action, frighten him, coerce him, surround and beseech him, change his mind, part with his values, victimize, or even in extreme cases, murder him, out to get him, if they could. Some narcissists withdraw completely from a world populated with such menacious and ominous objects. This is of course a prime example of confusing internal objects with external objects. These persecutory objects are internal. This is the narcissist's self-hatred. He hates himself for having failed. He wants to kill himself. He wants to destroy himself. He wants to eradicate himself. He wants to punish himself. But then he externalizes these internal voices and these internal objects, and they become external. They become, I don't know, the CIA. So this kind of narcissists avoid all social contact except the most necessary. They refrain from meeting people, falling in love, having sex, talking to others, or even corresponding with others. In short, they become schizoids, not out of social shyness, but out of what they feel to be their choice, and a preponderance of wariness, of caution. This evil, hopeless world does not deserve me, goes the inner refrain, and I shall waste none of my time and resources on these ingrates. The next solution inside the covert spectrum. So we're talking about covert narcissists, yes? The next covert solution is the paranoid, aggressive, or explosive solution. Other narcissists who develop persecutory delusions resort to an aggressive stance, a more violent resolution of their internal conflict. This kind of narcissists are dangerous. They become verbally, psychologically, situationally, and sometimes physically abusive. They become bullies. They insult, castigate, chastise, berate, demean, deride, despoil, degrade their nearest and dearest, often well-wishers, loved ones. They explode in unprovoked displays of indignation, righteousness, condemnation, and blame. Their world is an exegetic, hermeneutic bedlam, a madhouse. They interpret everything, even the most innocuous, inadvertent, innocent comment, good morning, as designed to provoke and humiliate them somehow. What do you think? I don't know it's morning? You think I need you to tell me it's a morning? And who are you to decide that it's going to be good? Are you God? Or do you want to control me and dictate to me that I should feel good, etc.? This kind of narcissists sow fear, revulsion, hate, and malignant envy wherever they go. They flail against the windmills of reality. They are pathetic, forlorn sight, but they are very, very, very perilous, dangerous. Often they cause long and lasting damage. Fortunately, mainly to themselves, but sometimes, to others. And then the final type of covert narcissist is the masochistic avoidant solution. Masochistic avoidant narcissist. When narcissist has deficient supply, he disintegrates, he decompensates. His defense mechanisms stop working. The false self no longer protects him from the world. So he's angered. It frustrates him, of course, and frustration breeds aggression. That's not me. That's Dollard in 1939. Frustration, aggression, hypothesis. Use your finger. So the narcissist is angered by lack of supply, of narcissistic supply, and he directs some of this fury inwards, punishing himself for his failure. And this masochistic behavior has the added benefit of forcing the narcissist closest to assume the roles of dismayed spectators or of persecutors. And so either way, to pay him the attention that he craves. It's a little like a child, you know, child who throws a temper tantrum. He does this to attract attention. And the same with the narcissist. I'm going to hurt myself. I'm going to commit suicide. I'm going to die. I don't want to live anymore. And so, I mean, this is cry for help on the one hand, but actually an attempt to attract attention. Self-administered punishment often manifests as self-handicapping masochism, a narcissistic cop-out. But by undermining his work, his relationships, and his efforts, the increasingly fragile narcissist avoids additional criticism and censure, negative supply. Self-inflicted failure is the narcissist's doing, and so proves that he is a master of his own fate, that he is in control. You know, to fail is an art form. If you are very, very good at failing, if you all that you have done, all that you've been doing in your life is failing, if you're an expert at failing, you will go on failing because that's what you do best. Masochistic narcissists keep finding themselves in self-defeating circumstances, which render success impossible. Millen wrote in the year 20 years ago that this kind of narcissists, the masochistic narcissists, they're coverts, of course, they try to avoid an objective assessment of their performance, to make it improbable. They act carelessly. They withdraw in mid-effort. They are constantly fatigued, bored, or disaffected. And so they're passive-aggressively sabotaging, undermining their lives, their work, their accomplishments, projects they're involved with. Their suffering is ostentatious. It's conspicuous. It's defiant. And by deciding to abort, they reassert their omnipotence. I destroyed this project. I ruined that company. I pushed my wife to cheat on me. The narcissist pronounce in public misery and self-pity. They are compensatory, and they reinforce, according to Millen, the narcissist's self-esteem against overwhelming convictions of worthlessness. The narcissist's tribulations and anguish render the narcissist in his own eyes unique. This kind of narcissist, this kind of covert narcissist, they are the saints, you know, the saints walking among us, some of whom get Nobel Prizes. They are actually covert narcissists. They are saintly, professionally saintly, or professional victims. They are virtuous, they're righteous, they're resilient, they're significant. Many of them become empaths, super empaths, and supernova empaths. It reminds me of Freemasonry. There's a Freemasonry of empaths. These are all very grandiose and narcissistic people. And the term empath is a self-aggrandizing term, often used by covert narcissists. These kind of narcissists, in other words, generate their own supply by attaining the high moral ground. They are God. They are the ones who punish. Who do they punish? Themselves, but it's okay. They still maintain the function. I mean, they still own punishment. They do the punishment. The worse the anguish and unhappiness of these eternal victims, the more relieved and elated they feel. It's a comfort zone. Okay. Now let's talk about the collapsed phase, the phase that leads to covert narcissism. The collapsed covert narcissist. I made a video about it yesterday, for those of you who survived it. And so I mentioned, I want to summarize yesterday's video. Yesterday's video was an amalgamation or aggregation of testimonials by dozens of people. So it was a bit messy, a bit chaotic, and I really, really apologize for the, you know, it's difficult to collate, to create a composite that is coherent, because people, you know, mismatch. But I want to pinpoint, home in on a few points. First of all, the collapsed covert narcissist. It starts with a collapse, Then there is mortification. You remember what mortification does? There are 5 videos dedicated to mortification on my channel. Narcissistic mortification disables the false self. So there's an overt classic narcissist. There's a problem with reality, some failure, some humiliation, public or otherwise, some defeat. He cannot cope with it, he collapses. And when he collapses, he's mortified because he comes face to face with his true self. There's no protection of the false self because the false self is disabled. The minute this happens, this kind of narcissist who went through a collapse and is about to become a covert in one of the 5 variants that I mentioned before he becomes a covert, he develops indifference. He becomes a doormat. He has no boundaries. He is open to exploitation and abuse. He is conflict averse. He avoids conflicts. He doesn't protest. He doesn't stand up for himself. He doesn't fight back. And this is intended to reduce dissonant anxiety. The collapse creates enormous anxiety, overwhelming anxiety. And to reduce it, the narcissist actually switches himself off. He doesn't exist. Because he stops to exist, he ceases to exist, no one can do anything to him. So he's immune to pain, immune to hurt. He reaches a state of equilibrium and homeostasis. He kind of freezes. It's a freeze response, in effect. It gives him time. Gives him time to do what? Gives him time to reconstruct the false self, to put the bricks back together. But he does this by becoming antisocial. So he becomes a con artist. He steals and cheats and lies. He does horrible things. It is via antisocial activities, immoral activities, defiant activities, lack of impulse control, and sometimes criminal activities that he regains his sense of omnipotence and mastery, which allows him to reconstruct the false self. Following the collapse and the mortification and the phase of indifference, the false self is restored, and that kind of narcissist switches back to overt narcissism. But again, once the false self is restored, there is a process of collapse of the covert state. Suddenly, all the tools of the covert state are no longer applicable, and they conflict with reality. So there's a collapse, technically. And there is mortification, this time mortification of the true self, or the other self, or whatever it is that is functioning there, the covert state, the covert solution. There's a mortification of that and a restoration of the overt. So, overt, classic, collapse, mortification, indifference, doormat phase, covert, and back, covert, collapse, mortification, overt. That's the sequence. So you ask me, why did you need 76 minutes yesterday to say what you have just said in 5 minutes? Because I like to hear my voice. I love my voice. It's resonant. It's amazing. Caruso has nothing on me. You don't know who Caruso is. Never mind that. Just shows you my age. Collapsed histrionic personality disorder. The collapsed state of the histrionic. The collapsed histrionic is usually, and there's a video, remember, there's a video about each of these topics, much longer video, where you can hear my voice interminably and fall asleep. My advice, fall asleep before you start to hear my voice, but that's up to you. Some of you are masochists, I'm sure. So, the collapsed histrionic. Collapsed histrionic is usually a woman, because, for a simple reason, most people diagnosed with histrionic personality disorder are women. So the collapsed histrionic is usually a woman with a body image issue, a somatoform problem, or body dysmorphia, body dysmorphic disorder. And so she has an issue with her body. She's not happy with her body. She misperceives her body. She has the wrong perception of specific parts of her body or the totality of her body. She has a low, and consequently she has a low sense of self-esteem, self-confidence, and self-worth. But the histrionic still needs the opposite sex, men in this case. And she still uses men to regulate her flagging self-esteem and deficient self-confidence. I'm talking, of course, about heterosexual histrionic, because there are They're homosexual histrionic, lesbians and gays, so on. But let's stick to the heterosexual histrionic. It's much more prevalent and common. So she needs men, and she self-medicates with men. Men are her medicine. She reduces anxiety with men. She teases them, she flirts with them, she seduces them, she conquers them. She's not really into sex, but she's into the conquest. She regulates her self-esteem this way. And this creates a permanent dissonance, anticipatory anxiety, because such a woman expects fully to be rejected and humiliated by men. In other words, her need for men makes her dependent on men. She hands over power to men. That's the irony. The histrionic, who supposedly conquers everyone, seduces everyone, she's the femme fatale, or the ingénue. The histrionic is actually at the mercy of men. Low self-esteem often leads to an impaired reality testing. A collapsed histrionic misreads environmental, social, and sexual cues, and often ends up being mocked, shunned, abused, or sexually assaulted by men, especially if she's drunk or abused substances. And she compensates for her insecurities with brazen defiance and grandiosity, as well as substance abuse, all of which compound her ability to properly gauge reality. Her inability, of course. The collapsed histrionic's feelings of inferiority and inadequacy lead her to social withdrawal and reclusiveness. So, usually collapsed histrionics would just stay at home. They wouldn't dare expose themselves to potential rejection and humiliation. She rarely dates men, this kind of woman. And when she does, she aggresses against, pushes away, and abuses males that she perceives to be alpha males, dominant males, jerks, even when they are genuinely interested in her. This is kind of preemptive abandonment. And this is the irony. She usually ends up with weasels and losers and beta males because she rejects ab initio, sight unseen, more dominant and accomplished men who are interested in her, because their rejection would hurt much more. Collapsed histrionic picks up safe men, weak, ugly, losers, junkies, men who are unlikely to painfully reject her, or if they reject her, it won't be painful. Histrionic personality disorder combines traits of both narcissistic and antisocial personality disorders. Actually, there are many advocates, many scholars who suggest that histrionic personality disorder is a subspecies or variant of psychopathy. It therefore stands to reason that these three cluster B dramatic, stalwart personality disorders, they share in the same etiology, same psychodynamics, which leads us back to the opening argument. Many histrionics, attention whores, use the opposite sex, the attention, the infatuation, the arousal, to regulate their emotions, moods, affect, and as well as sense of self-worth, self-esteem, and self-confidence. Potential mates are the histrionic supply. And similarly, when roundly and resolutely rejected, humiliated by rejection, abandoned, neglected, ignored, collapsed histrionics react with histrionic rage. In other words, we see a mirror image of narcissism here. Mirror image. Narcissistic supply, histrionic supply. Narcissistic rage, histrionic rage. The collapsed histrionic resorts to in-your-face defiance, often by triangulating with the third party, in order to provoke jealousy or to grievously hurt the frustrating and rejecting object, men. The histrionic's aggression is focused on restoring his or her grandiosity via a new and ostentatious sexual conquest. But it can and does have many other, mostly passive-aggressive or reckless forms of behavior. Compulsive shopping, shopaholism, gambling, lying, sabotaging, procrastinating, substance abuse, verbal abuse, brutal honesty, offensive humor and mockery, and so on. These are all expressions of collapsed histrionic personality disorder. So when a woman with mental health issues is sexually or otherwise rejected by her intimate partner, she acts out in one of two typical ways. And this is especially true if the partner also justifies his sadistic cruelty by adding abuse and overt humiliation to injury. So such women, if they're exposed to husbands who torture them, taunt them and torment them, tell them, you're ugly, you do not turn me on, you're fat, you don't know how to be a woman, you're stupid, you're repulsive, you're whorish, no other man would be interested in you, you don't understand my sexual and psychological needs, you turn me off. Many so-called intimate partners do this on a regular basis. It's a sadistic torture. And the union in such a case devolves into a power match, power play. The personality disordered woman, narcissistic, histrionic, borderline, seeks to obtain two goals to redress her grievances and her sense of offended justice. The first goal is to disprove her partner's evaluation of her and restore her self-esteem and self-confidence by proving mainly to herself how other men desire her. And this is accomplished by becoming a flirtatious, promiscuous, and seductive teaser. The second goal is to punish her non-intimate partner, by her non-intimate, so-called intimate. And she does this, she punishes him by rendering his property, herself, because he regards her as his property and she regards herself as his property, by devaluing his property. So when she becomes a slut, when she becomes promiscuous, when she gives her body indiscriminately to strangers in a bar, she's punishing her intimate partner by devaluing his property. She's transmogrifying into a slut. Or she can suddenly stop being a woman, eliminate all her feminine dimensions and behaviors, or become morbidly obese. So by sexually egregiously misbehaving with multiple men, the rejected woman transforms herself into a whore. And this is her way to penalize her abuser by devaluing and debasing herself, by self-trashing, by trashing his property. But some women choose the exact opposite solution. They passive-aggressively stop being women altogether. In a way, they unconsciously adopt the abuser's point of view. He regards them as not feminine, as repellent, and so they agree with him. They validate it. They neglect their appearance. They abandon their personal hygiene. They dress in tattered and shabby garb. They put on no makeup. They're physically inert, obese, neglect their duties, including in business, child rearing, childbearing, etc. This is their way of defying their mean and nasty partner. You say that I'm not a woman? Well, here you are. I stopped being one. These women eradicate their femininity and womanhood as a way of getting back at their mistreating, abusive partner. And all this is the package of collapsed histrionic when she becomes covert histrionic. Every single overlay, narcissistic, borderline, antisocial, histrionic, every single personality disorder has 2-3 states: overt, collapsed, covert. We just covered the histrionic and we move on to the covert borderline. The shy or the quiet borderline is a very controversial suggested diagnosis which has not been adopted and is not accepted and is not taught anywhere, and to my mind at least is a grievous error. Every borderline is sometimes shy and internalizing and sometimes psychopathic and externalizing. So I don't think it's a separate diagnosis. I think it's one of the self-states of every borderline. But there is such a state, no question. There's a state where the borderline is fragile, shy, vulnerable. And this kind of borderline internalizes her struggles and impulses, including aggressive impulses. She does not externalize them. She does not direct them at others. She internalizes. She directs them at herself. She becomes the exclusive target of her own chaos and turmoil. She doesn't act out, she acts in. And both the classic and the covert borderline act out and act in. I mean, both of them have these states of acting out and acting in. I would now like to read to you the list of traits of the covert borderline. It is based on this schematic which Arnold M. Cooper and S. Akhtar put up in 1989 when they described the covert narcissist. And what I would like, I've taken it and I've adapted it to describe the covert borderline. So the covert borderline, self-concept and emotional regulation. He has a false self, like the classic borderline. Both the classic and the covert states have the false self is intact. This is grandiosity, preoccupation with fantasies of outstanding love, undue sense of uniqueness, feelings of entitlement, alloplastic defenses. This is something that very often confuses diagnosticians, therapists, mental health practitioners. The grandiosity of the borderline. They often misdiagnose borderline as narcissist and narcissist as borderline. They both share grandiosity, exactly like the psychopath. It's another psychodynamic or theoretical reason to unify these allegedly, ostensibly separate disorders. The separation is artificial. Grandiosity is a seriously dominant feature of these and a very important psychodynamic precursor. So the covert narcissist covert borderline is grandiose. He has internal locus of control, seeming self-sufficiency, mood lability, emotional dysregulation and rationalization or reactance and defiance. He acts against authority, contumacious. He has a low boredom threshold and tolerance. He externalizes and internalizes. He has no suicidal ideation, and all his aggression is other-directed. He aggresses against others. He does not self-mutilate. We're talking about covert borderline, yes? Most covert borderlines are men. He does not self-mutilate. He has hypochondriasis and addictive behaviors. He's dissociative, has many dissociative self-states, mainly selective attention, confabulation, repression or denial, and he has a primary psychopathic protector. He has a primary self-state that kind of protects him and is very psychopathic. What about interpersonal relationships? The covert borderline has paranoid persecutory ideation, numerous but shallow relationships, intense need for love from other people. He is a people pleaser sometimes. Lack of real empathy in the primary psychopathic phase, valuing of children over spouse in family life. He has inability to genuinely participate in group activities. He's passive-aggressive, sullen, surly, self-denying, and these are also his behaviors. He's cunning, premeditated, and malevolent. He engages in intermittent reinforcement and therefore generates trauma bonding. He has scorn for others, often masked by pseudo-humility. So he holds everyone in contempt, but he pretends to be a nice, kind guy. He has histrionic attention-seeking, recklessness aimed at hurting or affecting others. He is sadistic, punitive, and goal-oriented, especially when he triangulates. So he would triangulate in a sadistic way and in order to punish his partner. And his triangulation would always be goal-oriented, not impulsive. He has object inconstancy and goes through cycles which are very reminiscent of narcissism. Idealizes, devalues, discards, reverts, or replaces. What about social adaptation? He's socially charming and he's charismatic. He engages in consistent hard work, but it's done mainly to seek admiration. This is known as pseudo-sublimation. He has intense ambition. He's often successful, and he's preoccupied with appearances. Is he ethical? Does he have any standards and ideals, moral or otherwise? Well, he is the covert borderline, a man usually, is idiosyncratically and unevenly moral. He has caricatured modesty. He is an activist very often. There are new studies published in the University of British Columbia linking virtue signaling and political activism to extreme psychopathy and narcissism. So he is an activist, and he has enthusiasm, fake enthusiasm, never mind, but enthusiasm for socio-political affairs. So many anti-racist activists, I wouldn't be completely shocked to discover that they are actually raging narcissists and psychopaths. He has inordinate ethnic and moral relativism. pretended contempt for money in real life, feigned spirituality and guru status. So many of the gurus, coaches, mystics, yogis, public intellectuals, philosophers turned psychologists, psychologists turned philosophers, they are likely covert narcissists or covert borderlines. And he has irreverence towards authority. What about love and sexuality? He has marital instability, likely to have divorced and married several times. He has cold and greedy seductiveness, extramarital affairs and promiscuity, uninhibited sex life. His cognitive style is dichotomous thinking, black and white, and splitting, primitive defense mechanism. You're all good or you're all bad. Something is all evil or all good. All, you know. He's impressively knowledgeable. He has egocentric perception of reality. He has a fondness for shortcuts to acquisition of knowledge. He's decisive and opinionated. He has a love of language and is often strikingly articulate. I'll finish by proposing that there is a covert state of psychopathy as well. There will be a covert antisocial personality disorder. And I think the covert antisocial is a combination of the covert narcissist plus the classic borderline. In other words, if you take a covert narcissist, you can rewind and listen to the criteria, and you add to that the criteria of classic borderline, classic, not covert, put them together, you get the covert, the person with covert antisocial personality disorder. And if we do this, we come up with something which is actually secondary psychopathy. So the covert, what we call today secondary psychopathy, is not a secondary state, another state of psychopathy. It's not like there are two types of psychopathy, primary and secondary. No, there's only one type of psychopathy, the overt classical type of psychopathy, and then there is a covert type of psychopathy, the covert state of that type. So remember, every overlay has overt, collapsed, covert. So when we have overt or classic psychopathy, then we have a collapsed psychopath that fails to realize his goals, and then he goes into covert state. The covert state of his disorder is what we call today secondary psychopathy, and it merges well with classic borderline. And that's why today we think we are reconceiving of classic borderline personality disorder as secondary psychopathy in women. So covert, what we call secondary psychopathy, it's a mistake. It's not another type of psychopathy. It's simply another state of psychopathy. It's classic psychopathy which had become covert owing to collapse and via mortification. Borderline and histrionic personality disorders may be manifestations in women of secondary type psychopathy as measured by factor 2 of the PCLR test. In other words, borderline and histrionic women may actually be psychopaths. A growing body of recent studies supports this startling conclusion. Survivors of complex post-traumatic stress disorder also manifest both psychopathic and narcissistic behaviors. They develop an overlay. Intimate part, and there is a video, unfortunately, with very few views, to my total surprise. There's a video that I made that clarifies the differences between CPTSD and borderline and explains how people exposed to complex post-traumatic stress disorder, narcissistic abuse, for example, actually end up developing narcissistic and psychopathic behaviors. And there's another video warning victims not to become narcissists and psychopaths. Intimate partners will not be surprised by this observation that borderlines are psychopaths. Impulsivity, defiant grandiosity, antisocial and interpersonal aggression, manipulativeness, violence, dysregulated negative emotionality, lack of object constancy, object impermanence, attachment dysfunctions, hostility, splitting or dichotomous thinking, high levels of distress, anxiety, depression, substance abuse. These are all typical and common among borderline personality disordered women and psychopaths, secondary psychopaths, covert psychopaths. And these women also defy gender roles and behavioral norms. They act masculine when they are stressed, when they anticipate rejection and humiliation or are subjected to neglect and are ignored, when there's withholding, when there's abuse, they become men, masculine behaviors, psychopathic masculine behaviors. But the borderline adds a twist to this cocktail, dissociation. Whenever stress levels and inner dissonance become intolerable, she hands over control to her inner psychopath. She depersonalizes, derealizes, disappears, or develops dissociative amnesia. She doesn't remember anything. And instead, out comes a psychopathic self-state. It raises the possibility that antisocial personality disorder is not actually a diagnosis or a clinical entity, but a culture-bound composite, a collated derivative. It is simply when people have simultaneously, when they have gone through a narcissistic collapse and became covert, and they have an overlay, a borderline overlay. This situation happens more often among women than among men. No wonder it's been first described and diagnosed in women. So this is it for today. I hope I gave you a map with checklists. You've had your fun with Minnie. Don't ask what I'm going to do to her after the video is over. I am quite sure it's not legal. And if you have any intelligent questions, which would be a refreshing change, please feel free to post them, and I promise to answer. If you don't suffer from any physical disability, try to use at least one of your fingers to search my channel and to search Google Scholar. There's a website of Google, run by Google, called Google Scholar. And in Google Scholar, you have only papers and articles published in academic journals, peer-reviewed academic journals. And there, the literature is much safer, much more reliable. People ask me about my paper. They ask to know in which journal it's going to be published. It's unethical, I cannot say. But if you go to my website, there's a page called Media Kit. So you go to my website, mediakit.html, and on the Media Kit, you can see that I'm the editor-in-chief, actually, of 3 academic journals in psychology and mental health. And I'm member of the editorial board of another 60, that's 60, academic journals in psychology, mental health, psychiatry, and neuroscience. And my paper is going to be published in one of them. At this stage, it did not pass peer review. It was just handed over to reviewers, and it's considered unethical to release the name, so my apologies. The minute it's published, of course, I'll make a big brouhaha out of it, because it would be a perfect opportunity to obtain supply. And that's what I'm here for. That's what Minnie is here for. Both of us are looking for supply. I mean, coffee I have as much as I want. Lately tea. But supply is in short supply.